a lot of the best games that exist because teams came together as full-time employees, built
Yeah.
something together, weren't just around for that project and everybody had a goodbye party and went to a nice restaurant if they succeeded, or sort of shuffled out dejectedly if they didn't, or whatever.
Mhm.
And like onto searching for my next contract. It was actually, no, we struggled and we made a hit that wasn't quite a hit, but it was enough to keep things rolling for a little bit.
Yep.
And then because we learned how each other worked,
Mhm.
and this speaks to me to this idea of the insane complexity of modern games.
Yep.
I don't want to diminish the complexity of music or television or movies. Games are so complex on so many different axes.
Uh-huh.
And when I think about us going to a place where we don't have teams that are motivated to gel like that,
Mhm.
because they know I'm just here for, hey, well, yeah, it looks like they hit production. Hey, they're entering production. Did everybody, put your application in to be on the production, to get into like the production contracts, right?
Mhm.
Because they're through pre-production now. Everybody, throw your hat in the ring.
Yep.
See who they pick up. I worry that we will actually stop producing the quality of products because those teams don't have that, or perhaps it's really just that the odds of the kind of serious quality hits that players love, that just really bring a lot of player value out there into the world, that those will become less common. And I think I see that. I think you see that to some extent in film.
Yeah, 100%. I think there are amazing films being made every year. Obviously a lot of the indie stuff that's coming through and everything. Melbourne International Film Festival is something that happens here every year, and there was just a great selection this year. I saw some astounding films, but like we can all see it at the top end of the industry. Like it's severely creatively bankrupt. It's a really worrying prospect being there. But what you're saying is absolutely, completely true. And I would state that we're already seeing it now, and we haven't even seen it yet to the degree that we're about to see it in the next 3 years. And I say that, and I choose the word see it, because actually, in actuality, we're not going to see it at all. There are just going to be fantastic experiences and innovations in our medium, both creatively, technologically, culturally, that we will never, ever get because someone closed Monolith, or because someone gutted Tango Gameworks. Like, to think of a studio, Tango Gameworks is such a devastating one, because Shinji Mikami, like, actually, if you hear that, this is anecdotal, I've heard from devs who were there, but he actually spent more time at the studio after he was about to leave, after the studio was purchased and everything like that, to ensure his succession and leadership. John Johannes, I got to know him a little bit through mentoring his talk for GDC, which was, I didn't do any of the work, it's all him, but in working with him on that, having some chats, and listening to his podcast episode with Adam Orth on the Game Maker's Notebook, which I co-host as well, you can hear this. It's hard to say it any other way, but excellence amongst this team that came from shipping multiple titles together. And John said something very interesting in that episode with Adam Orth, which I do recommend people listening to, is he said that it was said to him that it takes 5 years. It takes 3 games to build trust with a team as a leader. But when you work in AAA, and John's games, they take 5 years each to make. So you've got 15 years before you actually build trust with a team. So I like to say it takes 10 years to make a game studio. To even build one from scratch, it actually takes 10 years before you're a proper operating game studio, because you need those 3 games. You need to build that trust with your team. So all of these games that we're just not going to see now, it's not like games are going to come out, and it's not like the quality of games are going to drop over the next years, because as studios are falling, there are others that are rising that have been around for a certain amount of time, and no one can play the amount of games that are coming out at the moment anyway. And so every year, we're seeing more and more incredibly exceptional games coming out, and that's going to mask the fact that there actually should be 3 to 5 times, and in 5 years, 10 years time, there should be 3 to 5, 10 times the amount of fantastic games and cultural and technological and creative innovation. It's absolutely true what you're saying. And there's another interesting correlation when looking at other industries too, is that full-time employment and storied employment over multiple project iterations at a single institution comes from the scale of the technological problems within a creative industry. And you can see this localized within particular industries. So if we look at film, where you tend to see full-time employment in film is obviously on the corpo side, like in the studios and the distributors and stuff like that. But even the directors aren't employed, right? They're sole contractors, or they might get, if you're lucky now, the golden egg as a director is like an overall deal, right? Where you're assigned to a studio doing multiple projects.
You get to make 3 movies or something.
Exactly, spot on.
Yeah.
But where you actually will see employment in film is in special effects studios or in animation and VFX studios. So things like Weta become an institution where people work for many years across. Some folks at Weta, I'm on the board of an RMIT program with one of the guys at Weta, and he's been there for 15 years, worked on something like fucking 40 or 50 of the biggest films in the world, right? Because for Weta, they require that technological, conventional knowledge and institutional knowledge that has been there for years, right? And that's why animation has been the closest parallel to the way in which we structure our companies and the way in which we treat employment, and how we're much heavier on FTE than we are on fixed term contracts and stuff, and fixed term employment in video games is because of the scale of the technological problems. There is Paul Tuazor, I think his name was, from many years ago, did those, I think it was for the Game Project Outcomes series of posts on Gama Sutra, now gamedeveloper.com. And he looked at that and he said, it was essentially a correlative study. For those of you who don't know it, it's really worth looking up. It's amazing. It is correlative, but it's very interesting, where he basically surveyed something like 200 studios at multiple points through developing their games, and then linked their cultures and their structure, everything down to their production methodologies, whether they use Kanban or waterfall and stuff, a bunch of different axes. Then correlated that to the degree of success that they had with their games. And there were things like, some of the earliest studies or earlier realizations about burnout actually not being, crunching not being effective came from that, and actually it being a detriment. That was one of the first studies that was showing that. But one of the things that it really showed was culture is obviously king. But other things that came out of it was people who had worked at the studios that had people who had worked together on more titles had more success. Studios that had folks who had been there for over 8 years on average had more success. And it's just a fact. And now if I zoom out and I go back to my sort of state of dev, things are getting grim, forecast, this really ominous sort of heralding of what's to come in the industry. And when I talk about opportunities, one of them is our studios that are bucking against the trend of, or finding ways to continue this pattern or this truism within games, because it is a truism that some of the most successful studios in the world, on average, have made the same game iteratively over a decade, essentially. So, and this is a very crude example that I'm going to make. Obviously, it's more nuanced than this, but you could say that Supergiant's Hades 2 is Bastion 7. And you could say that The Last of Us 2 is Crash Bandicoot 17. You could also say that Sven over at Larian has been making Baldur's Gate 3 for the last 30 years. Because all of their games leading up to that have been iterations on that. And so he has built just to zoom in on Sven and that team, they have built and especially obviously with their fantastic, he's been in the limelight a bunch of times because of their comments on their disdain for how layoffs are being treated and how casually devs and talent and technological know-how and everything is turfed away. He's invested in these people, and it's resulted in arguably the best RPG ever made. After 30 years of toiling away in those mines, he's come back up with that grand diamond. And so there are people out there that are finding ways to do this in the current market. So one of them is Xavier Nelson at Strange Scaffold, Xavier Nelson Jr., where he's actually created a model where he doesn't have full-time employees really, but he has this tight-knit collective of folks that he rotates through, and known contractors that are kind of centered around him as this auteur or kind of driving force as the studio. If Strange Scaffold is kind of anyone or anything, it's kind of Xalavier and a couple of key contributors around him. And then they find ways to just ship and iterate as a studio and as a collective time and time again. And their focus is more of this kind of auteur subversive take. So they move between genres, but everyone knows if you grab a strange scaffold game, you're in for something quite subversive and quite auteur-led. And this also then attracts people who want to collaborate with him. And there's safety in those folks knowing that they don't have full-time employment, but they're actually coming onto a game that is going to ship. Because as Xelavier has put it before, he's not in video games to make video games, he's in video games to release video games, right? And then another example of this is Joost van Dongen of Galaxy Grove. So the former founder of Ronimo that made Awesome Noughts and everything is founded a studio called Galaxy Grove, working on his second title. Town to City, I believe it's called, but before that was Station to Station. Now, Joost is a very intelligent man who I've known for many years and has been a big influence on how I've approached games and, you know, how we ran our Mellow and ran our studio. And he basically picked a focus, which is management games. He even picked an art style, which is a voxel-based tilt-shifted art style. And he is just making cozy, voxel tilt-shifted management games. And he's essentially making one a year. Or one every 18 months or something. And not only has he been able to get both games signed to publishers in a time when no one was signing. Oh, and by the way, Xelavier has gotten a 5-game deal signed when no one was getting anything signed. But Joost has actually managed to get an equity deal as well in his studio when no one's doing equity or strategic, especially in random small indies. He's also scaled his studio from him when it started, programmer, founder, to now 20 people or something like that, I think he is. And he's got 4 or 5 titles in his portfolio ahead of him that he's going to move through. And so there is a way this is why I say that there are opportunities. I think if you're, I don't want to say smart enough, but if you're perceptive enough and you're creative enough to not just identify all of these things that I've mentioned and a bunch of shit that maybe I'm not even seeing or is out there too, and then you can find a way in which you can manage to lean into and focus on these truisms in games and game development, game production that you pointed out, Ben, which is that the ability to ship more games with the same people as rapidly as possible, that sort of can, and then if I add the part of focusing so that you have that community that you can bring with you. You know, Xelavier at Strange Scaffold talks about people in video games don't ever really think about building they think about building their brand as a studio, but not really their following in the way that a music artist would. You know, you buy a music artist's new album just because it's their new album. You don't read the reviews of it, or you don't look at the cover art or listen to tracks. You just start streaming it immediately, or back in the day, you would buy it because it's Björk's new album, because you love Björk. And so these studios that then focus on building this kind of loyal following where it's like Xelavier said, if you want weird, subversive, auteur-led indie games, you can just buy a Strange Scaffold game and we've got you sorted. The studios that focus on that and find ways to do this in an agile function, like Xelavier, who's set it up basically without needing to depend on fixed-term employment, full-time employment, you can have great success. And you can be signing the kinds of deals that not only no one is signing right now, but when I raised the prospect of multi-project deals as one of the major remedies for our industry, because this is my other little lukewarm take, is that one of the biggest remedies to everything that's happening right now, both for publishers to have more success in regards to being able to pick their winners. I had a dear friend of mine, say to me at DICE when we were hanging out this year, and they work in, I won't say whether it's VC or publishing, but essentially their job is to find studios who are going to blow up, and what game do they pick? And she was like, how do we actually find them right at that point when they're about to make their Baldur's Gate 3 or their Hades or that one that takes off? How do we know when that sort of good studio is going to have the sure thing? And my response to her was, well, increase your range. Instead of trying to be like a sniper shot precision, do a shotgun spread across 3 games, do an overall deal or a multi-project deal, and invest in increase your chances. And maybe instead of doing $100 million games, do 3 $33 million games, or give a studio $50 million to do 5 games or something like that, and increase your spread And so those studios that I think are able to lean into that and find those opportunities to just get more games out, have those overall deals happen. The thing that I was going to mention about, DICE, or chatting to folks about this there, is that Zalavir managed to get this deal done when talking to people at the other end of the industry. And, as a small indie team, that people at the other end of the industry, large VC firms that I was talking to, in conversations with some of the biggest money folks in video games they didn't even think that this was possible. They didn't even think that it was like, that's crazy. Why would you ever do that? No one's doing that. And I was like, well, it's done. There's an indie team that's done it already. So there are remedies, and I think there's very interesting fertile ground there, but it's a very scary time to be a studio head and having to navigate these stormy waters and shallow seas.
If you lead teams in game or software development and you're tired of wasteful and unreliable estimation, I've built an online course just for you. It's called Advanced Estimation for Game and Software Development, and it's a self-paced course with over 15 hours of content, real-world examples, and tools you can start using right away. Estimation doesn't have to be a morale-draining mess. Planning doesn't have to feel unrealistic and contrived. You can do better, and this course will help. Early access is now open with lifetime access and a big launch discount, but there's limited seats at this price point. Check it out at this URL or in the show notes below.